Well, thanks for joining us today, Nick. You are a staff writer for the New Republic, and also you're from the Sappony Nation, which is historically located within North Carolina and Virginia, in what is today known as, the quote unquote South. Could you start by introducing yourself and where you're calling from?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me today, Nick. So my name's Nick Martin. Calling in from Brooklyn, New York, which I've been living here for I guess about just a little over 4 years now. But my true home is in North Carolina. I was born and raised closer to Charlotte, but our ancestral home and our tribal community is located in what's called High Plains. That's in North Carolina and along the Virginia border. So we have tribal members. Historically, we were, like you said, in both states, but now we're all over. um,
Yeah.
so yeah,
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't know this about me, but my mom is actually born and raised in Raleigh, Durham, and she had, I should say, since she passed, a very thick Southern accent. And she lived in South Dakota, and my dad had, very thick res accent because he was born and raised in the Lord Rural Indian Reservation where I'm enrolled. And so it was kind of always a funny household because my mom just had this incredibly thick accent. And my dad had I don't know how I got I got the white bread accent, but
yeah. No, I was gonna say, like, because I don't really feel or hear like any of the twang there from
no.
you. Did you ever have it, like, and just work through it, or is it just never been there?
I don't think so. I don't think so. But when I'm around my mom's side of the family, like I definitely like they all sound like her, and for whatever reason, she kept the accent, and she lived in South Dakota for, several like 3 decades or more. And she never really, picked up that kind of bland Midwestern
Yeah,
accent where everything is like nasally. I guess
that,
that's how I talk. So I don't have
that's
any room
funny.
to.
That's funny because I don't have like a strong one when I'm just speaking, but I don't like I did the reading earlier of the article and I was noticing, and this is something I've noticed for a long time, is like I'm reading aloud, that's when it kind of comes out, which is funny to me. I don't know why that
Yeah.
is, but it definitely comes out more when I'm like reading a piece, but when I'm just regularly talking, which doesn't make any sense because both of my parents have strong Southern accents, but it is what it is.
Yeah, I mean that's a good place to start too because you live in Brooklyn and you wrote this piece recently in the New Republic, and I thought it was just a really good. It hit me in a way that like I don't think a lot of pieces that were coming out about the elections from Native America really did, and it's not because it was like better or worse. It was because it revealed a specific kind of politics and culture in a place that we often don't think of as Indian country. And that is, the geography that we typically think of as, the South. And that in the South itself, we don't think, especially in like North Carolina, even though North Carolina has a large indigenous population, we don't think of it as necessarily Indian country. And some of the commentators online and in the media, they have a really hard time confronting, what is modern indigenous people. And a lot of people don't know this, but they do know this subconsciously, but the way it plays out in the media is that the way that native people are racialized first and foremost is through our disappearance, right?
Yeah.
And I think that really reflects in any kind of like exit polling that people are trying to do, even CNN. I thought it was hilarious. I wasn't really offended by it. I
No, no.
understand
Yeah,
the
I know what
something
you're
else
talking about. Yeah,
category.
yeah, yeah. Like that was kind of funny. And it like obviously it's now been like memed to death and back, but like
Yeah.
it was kind of like funny insofar as like we've spent all of this time talking about what erasure and all these like being made invisible by the media, and then like that's like the election night coverage, and so it immediately gets this huge blowback, which did seem to somewhat at least course correct some of the media's erasure of indigenous voting populations. But I mean, again, still like it was mostly native reporters that I felt like coming out of the election were, or not even just native reporters, but reporters on indigenous affairs desk as well. that were doing the best job of like kind of capturing what this like turnout looked like post election. So it wasn't surprising that CNN did that, but it was like funnier than I think it was offensive for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, it shows though. Like, I mean, there is conversations, and some of it I think is a little bit harsh in its attack on the so-called woke left, because like reading this piece, there is a level of consciousness, especially on the right, around these issues, and I think the left, or like the liberal media, takes it for granted a lot of the times, and doesn't really try to understand the social dynamics at play, especially in like the rural South, or like even just rural geographies in general. And I think it's easier, and you point this out, in this piece, and you probably have you probably feel this way a lot living in Brooklyn, that there is this kind of derision towards or oversimplification, to be generous, towards the politics of the South, and what it looks like, and how that plays out, and how we understand why people make certain political choices and support certain political campaigns.
Yeah, I mean, and that's something that the media struggle with for. I mean, part of that is geography, right? Like just a matter of like most of the national media being based around like this beltway, just kind of like northeastern style, and that just lends itself to a misunderstanding of a regional of regional politics, but and which is something that we are like our union at the New Republic is also working to overcome, because currently we have to. The only reason I'm in Brooklyn still is because we
Mm.
have to live in New York or DC to work, and that's the case for lots of, not most publications, but lots of publications, and it can just inherently limit how you understand a different region. And but also part of it is the fact that like I think there's a lot of write off over what, like outside of primary season, there's just a lot of write off of the South in general in terms of like how it will vote, and what its politics are. So if you're only seriously covering an area's politics every 4 years, and then even then you're kind of glossing over it, you're never really going to capture the minutia of like what the actual region looks like, and why it votes like it votes, and why, to get point back to the piece, why it holds certain cultural or social ills, that like people are, when you move up, when I first moved up here, it's like people just felt very, I think, shocked by a Trump presidency. Like, because I moved up here in 2016, in like August, so like 2 months before. And I wasn't working at the New Republic at the time, but I was in media, and it was just like a widespread shock. And I was coming from North Carolina, and I was like, well, you people don't know what the fuck you're talking about,
Yeah.
because this was like telegraphed by the last 10 years of politics, and especially in North Carolina, especially, but also just the broader South as well. And hopefully, I don't know. I don't know if I can make an assessment that like that anything has changed, or if the media, or even the liberal media, has gotten better at covering those kind of politics. But it's definitely been interesting to see from inside the belly of the beast. I can say that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I come from a state that is very, right wing, and I would say in similar ways, to the South. And the first time I guess I ever experienced it was like obviously like through the racial dynamics when we would go and visit my mom's family in the South. Like there was obvious, segregation was still like obvious. Like even though it has formally ended as a policy, it's very obvious in the way that socially the like a certain kind of Southern culture is kind of enacted. And the other thing that I found fascinating is I remember we had driven my mom's car, and she had South Dakota license plates. And back in the day, like when there were, I think we had like one or two Democratic senators from South Dakota.
Mm-hmm.
This guy chased us down in a Walmart parking lot, and my mom was like, thought something was going on, and he's like, do y'all really support Tom Daschle? My mom was like, what?
That's wild. That's
And
wild.
yeah, and he was like, he's a socialist. I think that was the first time I ever heard the word. I was young, but it sticks out in my mind, and I was like, was like, why does this guy hate Tom Daschle? Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I didn't understand anything about it, and so that was like the first kind of like experience of like a political culture, in the South. And I would say that a lot of my mother's family was also taken up, at first time the next time I really saw it was um with the Tea Party movement. They were really taken by
Mm-hmm.
that kind of Tea Party politics of fiscal conservatism and blah 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 blah, allegedly, right? And then of
Right.
course when they got into power, it turns into this like white supremacist culture war bullshit, which
Yeah,
was always there to begin with. And so
yeah,
yeah, I agree with you, like in the sense that there was a lot of telegraphing that this was going to happen.
yeah. And I think just trying to what have kind of been faced with over the last 4 years, and what we'll likely be faced with for the rest of our lives, is how to combat that, and not just how to combat that, but how to organize against that in a way that isn't just. And this is also something that I think I kind of touched on in the piece, but I'm just like, the answer can't just be to not be Donald Trump. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, yeah, Biden won the popular vote by what's looking like 5% or 7 million votes. Um, but you still have to contend with the fact that like you saw a record turnout for Trump this election. Like 400,000 more people in North Carolina voted for him than voted for him in 2016. Now you can, obviously attribute some of that to population increase, because North Carolina is a very fast growing state, but definitely not all. I mean, my county, my home county, is a very rural county, and it went to and like 7,000 more voters came out than what did a few years ago. And that's just when you see that magnified across like 60 rural counties, you have to like sit there and ask yourself, as a party, like we're clearly not motivating people in the right direction
Mm-hmm.
in these places. And that also, it just also happens to coincide with the fact that like many, not all, but many of the native communities in North Carolina, are in rural communities. Now, not all of them sided for Trump, but a significant amount of them did. And so I think there's something to be kind of grasped with and grappled with in terms of how do you unpack that politically, and then how do you also unpack that culturally? Because I think they're two similar things, but they're not the exact same thing, which is something that I'm still like trying to tussle with myself.
Yeah, a friend of mine, Jordan Revels, is from the Lumbee tribe, Robeson County.
Nice.
We had him on a it was a post-election hangover show, and he gave a really interesting breakdown of like Lumbee politics. And he's, it's not, there is a conservative bent, like, no doubt. And for those of you that don't know, I think there's like around over 200,000. I can't remember. Native people in North Carolina, so it has a
Yeah.
fairly significant population. Like it's actually larger than, like, say, South Dakota, which we see is like overtly indigenous in many ways.
Yeah.
Um, but he was telling me that when Trump came to town, Trump actually had like a legitimate offer, like actually a material like policy reform for, or a policy program for Lumbee people, whether we like it or not,
Right.
in the sense that he offered a pathway to federal recognition, which is incredibly important. If you look at Robeson County, which is one of the
Yeah.
poorest counties in North Carolina, it provides a pathway to federal assistance, and certain kind of federal programs and benefits that are available to indigenous people to help like revitalize culture and all of those kinds of things. And so that's not, whether we like that or not, whoever's giving that kind of extending that kind of gift, so to speak, of recognition, we can't deny the kind of historical struggle that Lumbee people have undergone. And he even told me, he was like, he's like, I had relatives who voted blue all the way down the ticket except for the presidency, and he
Yeah.
was like, that doesn't make, it makes them Donald Trump supporters, like, no doubt, but it doesn't make, like, it makes it a little bit more complicated. And it's not necessarily, like, my argument would it, I mean, obviously there's tinges of racism. He did talk about that internalized anti-blackness that a
Yeah.
lot of Lumbee that is very prevalent, not just in Lumbee. But yeah, it was, you know, it's a very complicated thing. And like, you know, I think that if you look at like even the I don't know, like I don't even know what Joe Biden's Indigenous Affairs program is, other than just like doing what Obama did, you know.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, and that's been, I mean, there's a couple things to just kind of dig into there, and just thinking about, first of all, like, there is this, I think one of the reasons we kind of don't think of North Carolina in a broader sense when we like talk about Indian country, right, is because of the way that Native people during the 20th century in the state, and in the 19th century, we were racialized, by this system of, first by the system of, slavery, and subsequently Jim Crow. But we were never, I mean, aside, like, you have, I guess, just like kind of take a step back here, you have one federally recognized, nation the in the state. That's the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians in the western part of the state. The other, 7 tribes in the state are state recognized, and the Lumbee had a bill that was passed, in the middle of the 20th century, but it didn't effectively do anything in terms of actually bringing them in full. And so the relationship that most people have, and this is just me also speaking anecdotally through my experience, is that the relationship that most people in the state have to the native populations is much more of one that they feel similar to, like, if you have like a black part of town or a Hispanic part of town, or you know what I mean, like, where it's like they view us more as like a racial community and not as political entities. And when that happened, and that has obviously been propagated by, the non federal recognition of, the tribes, and specifically the Lumbee tribe in this instance. And so when that happens, you get to, and is compounded by years of inaction. I mean, we're talking, like, one of the things that probably hurt Joe Biden is the fact that he was vice president before, right? So he had 8 years to do the thing that he then subsequently promised at the beginning of October, to push for the federal recognition of the Lumbee tribe. That's where, like, that whole, whether it was Biden or whether it was Trump, it was just also craven to me in a really, like, it's hard for me to say that, like, sovereignty should be on the ballot. Like, I don't know that I'm still like grappling with the language of how to describe that. But like,
yeah.
in the recent interview, it was really tough for me to, like, I was talking about, this was with a Lumbee scholar, who works at the University of, North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and we were just talking about, like, this transactionary sense of, like, vote for me and I will, deign you with, the gift of sovereignty. It's just like one of the wildest. Like, I really hope 100 or 200 years from now we look back on that and say, like, that was some extremely wild, imperialist colonialist bullshit, because, like, that's what it is. Like, the idea that you could vote for your sovereignty, and not just establish it or have it recognized, willingly by, fellow government, is something that's just a little disturbing to me. And it's specifically as a member of a state recognized tribe, it's something that is always kind of sat at the forefront, and been very formative to my understanding of, like, the BIA, and as well as the congressional path to, federal recognition. And so that's where you kind of get, like, this, you compound it with, like, anti-blackness that definitely exists, I think, in all tribal communities, in the South, that obviously in different, shapes and forms and magnitudes, but it's something where we are still working to unpack that, because, again, of that what I'm talking about earlier, was like, we were racialized, so we were essentially, like, if you go back and look in the beginning of the 20th century, what happened in North Carolina was they started to establish, education, programs. So you had school. So, like, the Sappony tribe, we in High Plains, we had our own school. The Lumbee tribe had their own school. A lot of different tribes had their own schools. That money was pulled, if you go back and look, from the Department of Negro Education, and it's like this tiny sliver out of this other tiny sliver of the state's overall budget for education. And I think that's a really good way of kind of emphasizing the fact that, like, a lot of this anti-blackness comes, and not just anti-blackness, but just racism in general within the communities, can kind of stem from this place of competition opposed to one of cooperation and organizing together in our own unique and separate battles. And so it's just kind of really driven a nasty strain of Southern racism, not just, I mean, American racism is what I meant, that has kind of just lingered and festered into the 21st century, to the point that we're like earlier in the summer, I know like a big thing for the down in Robeson was like the heckling of the Black Lives Matter protesters, and like trying to like unpack that as, and then you try to unpack that as like a national media person who doesn't, like, unless you're from there, it's really hard to like unpack all of that history and know innately all of that history, and so that makes it really difficult then when I'm thinking about this as a journalist to say this is how coverage should be of this region, specifically of this state, just because of that dynamic that we're seeing play out now. So I don't know, that felt like a lot of word vomit, but like that's basically just trying to unpack like how we get to a place where it's like Donald Trump can both play up this kind of more like, white supremacist figure and also draw in Native voters by promising them the gift of federal recognition. Like that is like, there's no easy way to explain it. So you do have to kind of ramble for a while to get to that. Yeah. But yeah, so that's kind of like where I have settled on things. I don't see like a clear path out of that just because of the way that federal recognition works is currently constituted. So, I don't know how we change that before like the 2024 election or the 2028 election and so forth.
Yeah, it's a very tangled history in many ways. And what I find really fascinating about it, even like coming from Trump, who is famous for saying during a congressional testimony in 1993, they don't look like Indians to me, right? And he was talking specifically about the Mashantucket Pequot tribal nation,
that's right,
who he saw as potential competitors for I think they own like a Foxwood Resort casino in Connecticut, and he was trying to build something that he saw it as competition. And so he was like,
is this you discussing Indian blood? We're going to judge people by whether they have Indian blood, whether they're qualified to run a gaming casino or not?
That probably is me, absolutely. Because I'll tell you what, if you look at some of the reservations that you've approved, you, sir, in your great wisdom have approved, I will tell you right now, they don't look like Indians to me, and they don't look like the Indians. Now, maybe we say politically correct or not politically correct. They don't look like Indians to me, and they don't look like Indians to Indians, and a lot of people are laughing at it, and you're telling how tough it is, how rough it is to get approved. Well, you go up to Connecticut, and you look. Now, they don't look like Indians to me, sir.
Thank God that's not the test of whether or not people have rights in this country or not, whether or not they pass your look test.
Depends whether or not you're approving it, sir.
No, it's not a question whether I'm approving it. It's not a question whether I'm approving it. Mr. Trump, you know in the history of this country where we've heard this discussion before, they don't look Jewish to me.
Oh, really?
They don't look Indian to me. They don't look Italian to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a test for whether people could go into business or not go into business, whether they could get a bank loan. You're too black. You're not black enough.
I want to find out. Well, then why you're approving for Indian? Why don't you approve it for everybody then?
That's not a
if your case is non-discriminatory, why don't you approve for everybody? You're saying only Indians. Wait a minute, sir. You're saying only Indians can have the reservations. Only Indians can have the gaming. So why aren't you approving it for everybody? Why are you being discriminatory? Why is it that the Indians don't pay tax, but everybody else does? I do.
But what he was saying, and what's not captured in that video, and like what I'm disappointed in about the media for doing that, is like they never showed who these people were, right? Like the Pequot tribe, because what he was saying was that they're black and therefore they're not indigenous. That's what he was saying in that congressional hearing, and it doesn't fit the kind of tightly packaged media narratives of who is and who isn't an indigenous person, because the racial dynamics of this country really determine, like whether we like it or not, how other people view us, right? We often don't get to decide for ourselves who's indigenous and who's not, but we have a national media mouthpiece, who either on one hand erases us and calls us something else, quite literally, or, doesn't see, or they want something that's like identifiably or stereotypically indigenous, like with some feathers or some horses or something like that, or long hair.
Yeah.
People who look like me.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you have this really racist and archaic system that's based on the most vile forms of anthropology that decides, if I'm talking about the federal recognition process, that decides who and who isn't indigenous, and like according to the United States government. And the issue with that, I mean, we can criticize it as much as we want to, but with the era of self-determination and the further incorporation of a native political class in DC, frankly, the people who are making those decisions are actually other indigenous people.
Yeah, right. Which, like, then again, like, which again goes back to this larger question of like, not even a question, but it's something that I've noticed. I mean, I've written it myself, but I've also noticed like other people that have covered Indian country in the media. I mean, there's this kind of refrain that's like Indian country is not a monolith, right? And I've seen that sentence quite a few times, but it's like I've never actually seen any like of these kind of more major outlets apply that sentiment to their coverage,
Right?
Because it's the same way where it's like I see all these headlines where it's like, oh man, a record number of Native candidates were elected to Congress this cycle. And I did like this kind of longer piece earlier before the election that kind of broke down like, okay, like we can sit here and say that congressional representation is a goal, right? Like, and it can be. But I tried to reckon with like, how much does that representation help you if you just have like, 6 Markwayne Mullins sitting in Congress? Like, it doesn't do you any good. So like, there is a lot of like fine text to be read here that I think a lot of outlets aren't necessarily, their infrastructure isn't there, one, to grasp that basic fact. It takes somebody, like I thought at High Country News, Graham Lee Brewer did like the best job of kind of unpacking Markwayne Mullin as like a political entity in a profile he did earlier. I think it was earlier this year. It might have been last year, but I think it was earlier this year.
Actually won an award.
Yeah. Like, it was like this really great piece that actually reckoned with something. And it's like, I would never read this by I would never read this by like a staff writer at like the Atlantic or the New York Times or something like that, because it's like, it's really difficult for them to grasp that like you can be a tribal citizen and you can be elected to Congress, or you can be a high-ranking member of the BIA or whatever, and you can actively work against things like indigenous human rights or indigenous civic rights, like that. Like, those things are not do not cancel each other out. And I think the more that we're able, like, part of this just also speaks to like a larger need, not just for indigenous cheerleaders, but we need more indigenous critics. We need people that are willing to say, no, this person's an asshole. That's like actively blocking the items that we need out here to be passed. And I think as like anything, it's like the more that you see Native-run publications, and the more that you see Natives be hired at these publications and outlets and TV stations, etc., you kind of hope that will happen. But in the same sense, like, you also kind of sense like the same way that like the institution of DC has kind of in some ways overridden a great many Native folks that have gone there with good or bad intentions. The media complex could do the exact same thing, where it's just we want cheerleaders, we want people who don't really have an edge or a bite to them to say like what's real, and that can be a little frustrating to see. But it's like it just gets back to this, like, again, to the initial point of like representation can't be the goal if like that representation is actively working against the larger community. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're getting at something that I struggle with a lot. I think a lot of people do, because on one hand, you recognize the profound erasure and disappearance of indigenous people and the constant, like, sometimes purposeful but sometimes not, misrepresentation of indigenous people within, just popular culture. Like I was thinking about that series on HBO, Lovecraft Country. I actually stopped watching because I was like, this is really cool. Like, they're doing some interesting things here. Like, it's actually scary. It's well written. It's like, it's, woke, quote unquote. But the whole thing about the Taino, or the Arawak, person, character in there, and the way that, first of all, she wasn't indigenous, and and it was like this, they killed her in the most violent way, and like, or them, I should say. And it was, it was just like, it hit all the stereotypes, and like, I couldn't help but be upset by it. And then I look at like the media landscape and the political landscape, and do I think it's important that we have political representation that's indigenous? Yeah, but like, I think that's like kind of a low priority for me in this moment in time, because if we look at New Mexico, now we have 2 indigenous Congress women.
That's right. That's right.
We have one, Deb Haaland, who has been lukewarm, I'll put that generously, on fracking and the environment. And now we have Yvette, I forgot her name, because she just, Yvette Harrell, who's from the Cherokee Nation, who is 100% pro fracking, and so much more. And she represents the southern part of New Mexico, which is incredible. I mean, it's pretty much just an extension of eastern Texas, for all intents and purposes.
Gotcha.
And she represents a kind of, pro-energy, pro-oil agenda. Like, even her Shirley Torres, the incumbent, couldn't beat her. But even like Torres was like pro-fracking. She would, like, I remember, like,
she ran way to the right. Yeah.
And like, and Deb Haaland didn't run a single ad campaign like on television at all, but Torres had to, because it was like this question of fracking, and New Mexico is like, the 5th largest oil producing state in the country, right next to Alaska, which is huge.
Yeah.
And she had to take this like very like pro fracking stance, and against Medicare for all, against any kind of progressive agenda. She was a Democrat, in I wouldn't say in name only, but she was like a blue dog Democrat, I guess.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to see that, because how do you have a conversation, when you're saying, like, you have somebody like Deb Haaland, who represents, I think, more to a lot of people in kind of the progressive movement than she really adheres to those progressive ideals. And then at the same time, but you still like you need somebody, because the alternative is much worse.
Right.
And then you'd get somebody who is like running an overtly indigenous campaign that's 100%, for the right. It's like, we have to have some level of criticism. There has to be space for this. But I feel like even within the Get Out to Vote campaigns, there wasn't a critical conversation around this. There wasn't a space to be like, like, even the fact that Deb Haaland doesn't have to run political ads in her district should be troubling, because nobody's pushing. I mean, like, even in a normative political sense, nobody's pushing her, to adopt more like progressive or environmentally sound policies. And so it creates this kind of weird thing, and it's like, I recognize that, and as a writer, because we're such a small community. Like, it's hard to be a critical voice all the time, because you can easily be ostracized and drowned out because you're already under constant erasure.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that you always kind of have to. especially if the writing that you do, like if you're a journalist whose writing is predicated on sourcing,
Mm-hmm.
like one of the useful things I like when I first started here at the New Republic like a year ago, I was like a little dubious because we also have a DC office, so I was like a little dubious about like is New York the best place of the two for me to be to report on what I need to report on. But I also recognize that like if I went to DC, it would like I would just become something of like a source hound, where it's just like it becomes this like again a transactionary thing where it's like if you know write something positive again about my person, I'll give you an interview with them and so on,
Mm.
and that just inherently limits, I think, not inherently, but it can oftentimes limit a reporter's ability to hold the powerful or the elected officials accountable. And that like that's a really basic thing to say. But like it's another thing to see play out in practice. It's the same way that we've seen kind of like larger, like outside of Indian country politics. It's like we've seen larger critiques of kind of these like the parlor game coverage style of like the New York Times of like the Trump presidency or something like that. Like not treating it as like um, whatever the administration run by extremists, but trying to like equate it to past administrations. Which like again, like you could like there's like I think a leftist critique to be made that you could do that, but they're certainly not coming at it from
Yeah.
that perspective. So it just kind of like again like if it's a situation where you're an outlet who like your bread and butter is getting these interviews, getting video interviews, or just like print or digital interviews with people, and it's an access game, then you're inherently going to be somewhat limited in your ability to speak truthfully about any of the representatives' actions in Congress. And I mean, even to a certain extent, like I've been able to interview Representative Holland a couple times now, and I think I always it's something that's always in the back of my mind too, because it's like if I go out here and like I slammed her in a piece or something for not fighting hard enough, like what you're saying basically, right? Like I would have to do that, recognizing that like I probably wouldn't get an interview
Oh,
for a
dude,
while.
you by coming on my podcast, she listens to my podcast, so you're like you've just iced yourself out. No, I'm just
I
kidding.
iced myself out. Damn. No,
But like
but yeah.
like to her credit, like she does. I mean, like to her credit, like she does send her staff to our events, and like they do listen to the critiques. And I've actually seen her sit down with people who are other indigenous Pueblo women who are critical of her, and she does listen. But I don't think she, I guess I'll from a like a purely objective standpoint, she doesn't do anything about it, but she does listen.
Yeah, which I mean, like again, is at least something, right? Like that's the qualifier there. It's at least something because like I don't know that Tom Cole or Mark Wayne Mullen or Yvette Herrell are gonna like be turning up to any of those events or listening to those folks necessarily.
Oh, dude,
Um,
there's subscribers on the Patreon, man.
I mean, I hope so. I really hope
Just
so
kidding.
because that would be like fantastic. No, but it's like the point that we're talking about is like it's part of it is it goes back to this larger kind of thing that we grapple like you and I think spoke earlier in the spring. We kind of grappled with this more existentially, but it's like this it gets back to this larger question of like should we be in like whenever we're participating in like a colonialist infrastructure, whether that's media, whether that's the academy, whether that's politics, it kind of always gets back to me of this question of like representation can never be the end goal in those instances because you have to have a set program that or set like policy or program or something that drives you. You can't just be like, I want more Native people in Congress. I want more Native people in the media or in the university. Because like what these institutions naturally do over time, I mean, like their entire purpose since the beginning is of like assimilation, is of colonization, like it's the like and so we are working now within those machines to kind of break them down and reorient them in a way that takes into full consideration what we need in Indian country, but it is difficult. It is just difficult to do that within a lot of these places because like they're not trained, like they're trained to do the opposite of what we need. That like
Yeah.
it's kind of, and like I know I'm speaking really broadly here, but like across the board, like that is true. Like the media does not really exist to report and tell you what's going on in Indian country. Doesn't like our schools, American schools don't exist to tell you about like indigenous land theft and dispossession and genocide. Like these things don't exist for those reasons. They have existed for a long time for the exact opposite of those reasons. And so we have to grapple with, in a lot of ways, whenever it's like any sort of person with a voice, whatever field that voice would be in, we have to grapple with this larger idea of like, if I'm participating in, if I'm like a staff writer at the New Republic, like how am I actively, like my existence alone at the New Republic doesn't mean that I'm doing good reporting on Indian country. I actually have to do the work to show that. In the same way that like Deb Holland or you as a professor or whoever, like we have to actively do the work to prove that like it's not like representation isn't the end goal. We have to like advance beyond that, and that's something that I mean I really struggle with that still. Because I'm like, well, damn, should I work for an indigenous publication? Should I start my own? Should I like move back home? What is my best use in this larger ecosystem? Which is something that like across fields when I talk with folks, other indigenous folks, I mean, that's something I think a lot of people are becoming more self-aware of and trying to unpack as we kind of, we're no longer like, it's not the exception or exceptional that there's a native in Congress or that there's a native at a New York publication, right? Like once you get beyond the novelty of our existence in these places that we previously have not existed, it's like, okay, now what the fuck are you going to do with it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it was Tristan Ottone who wrote on Twitter recently. He said something to the effect, I think like CBS News was like, kind of like wrote this like puff piece about 6 Native American congresswomen or congresspeople, I should say, were elected, this time around. And he like quote tweeted it and he said, yeah, and this Congress that now has more Native people than your entire newsroom has in its, in its entire existence.
That's right. That's right.
Which is like, it's a burn, but it's like, it's also just true. And I think, this is something I also, like I struggle with. And I was actually reading, because like when I was doing research for this interview, I went, I don't have a subscription. I only could read 3 articles. So like I read 3 of your articles. I used my 3 month or free articles. But like you report on regular politics, quote unquote, like normative politics without like the kind of like feathers, hanging from the dashboard or from the rearview mirror. And I think that's one thing that's always frustrated me is that like, a lot of people, and I have this podcast for many reasons, it is like specifically and, unapologetically an indigenous left podcast. But at the same time, we don't just talk about indigenous issues in the sense that it's like confined to this like one category where it's like, oh, today it's, or this month it's Native American Heritage Month, or, it's Columbus Day this day, or Indigenous Peoples Day. But to understand that we do, like, we're experts in like the world, we can, understand international politics, we can understand domestic politics, we have something to say beyond the category of what can just be considered, quote unquote indigenous, right?
Yeah.
But also indigenous itself should be not a marginal kind of perspective, but it should be a central perspective. And I think, I think there is like a valid critique, of these kind of representational politics in the sense that it's like, it can't just be like, oh, here's our indigenous voice, we'll tack it on, move on to the next thing. But to say that like there are experts and people who are professionals and have, something to say that it goes beyond just like what is, normatively acceptable as like an indigenous perspective.
Yeah. And that's something that's always kind of been somewhat, I don't know if easy is the right word, but like for me, it's like I didn't get into journalism doing the work I'm doing now. Like I started as a sports journalist, and I did that for the
What was your
first.
sport? Like, what was the one you covered?
So I when I first graduated school, I kind of came out and I got a job at a sports website that is now no longer technically existing. It's called Deadspin, and I covered just college athletics more generally. So I did like investigative reporting, but also just did like fun dumb blogs for them. And so it's every blue moon, like I would kind of get like I remember there was one piece I did where it's like an old quarterback for the Washington NFL team was trying to make a point that like native people like the R word or whatever. And like I
Well,
did a post about that, or I did like it, but like it would be like very rare. Like I wasn't doing them consistently. That didn't define my beat or whatever. My beat was writing about college football, which was like it was a great gig. I didn't start writing about politics until uh, I guess right around the 2016 election, when, which again, like I was still a sports reporter at that point because I just graduated school. But I even as I kind of transitioned over to doing the more political beat, I knew that I wanted to like I saw an absence in terms of like the media's coverage of Indian country, but I was like, well, I can't. It's like partially it's like it's really difficult to say that any one person can be an expert on Indian country. I think that's a lot to thrust upon
yeah,
anybody's shoulders because I can tell you pretty well about North Carolina's situation, like what's going on, but like when it comes to like other states, when it comes to other tribal nations, other tribal communities, um, I'm like I have to do the work of reporting and research to understand what the hell I'm talking about. Otherwise, I will, and I'm sure sometimes in the past have sounded, somebody who's like either out of pocket or just like, maybe a little doesn't know what they're talking about. And that's part of like the work of being a journalist is constantly pushing yourself to like learn up on things that you're not trying to be representative of a place or a people in your writing, but trying to also do them justice in the sense that it's like we are not. This is a quote you gave me actually a while ago, but it's like we're not parochial actors. Like we don't
yeah.
exist within these little bubbles. Like that's what a lot of people would like for us to do. They would like for us to operate kind of just like on our own on little islands away from everyone else, but we don't. Like we have things to say. That means we can be critical of our own tribes. We can be critical of other tribes. We can be critical of other indigenous and conversely anti-indigenous movements across the world. Like we can have thoughts
Mhm.
on what's happening in Palestine or Bolivia or wherever. It's like we don't have to be confined to commenting on what's just happening in our tribal community. And but at the same time, you have to do that with a sense of accountability and a sense of responsibility to the people that you're writing about. And so, like, whenever I don't. So that's just a long way of saying that, like I can pretty easily write about, just broader, like the piece that you're talking about that you kind of had me on for today. Like that piece, I don't know that I mentioned anything about Native people in that piece.
It was just a list. You did the
Yeah,
listing.
yeah, right. So it's just like it wasn't about that. It was about North Carolina politics. Of which, like like we said, like there are close to 200,000 natives in the state, so like, they're obviously an integral part of that. But they're not. It's not like the whole reason that I wanted to write that piece. I wanted to write that piece as somebody who grew up in that state as well, and grew up in a white community that like fostered a lot of the this kind of like I guess xenophobic and racist and like gendered views of society, and I wanted to like reflect that 4 years removed from the first Trump election, they're still pretty down with it, and we have to understand how to organize that. And I say we, I'm not talking about we, the Democratic Party. I don't necessarily align myself there, but it's like I mean we, as in like people who give a shit about like what the future of that state, and then like me as a person like cares about the future of my tribal communities and the other tribal communities in the state. Like we have to organize in order to combat that and to kind of unwind what has been like a historical trend there to skew towards like these Jesse Helms, Donald Trump type ideologues that are really just really good race baiters at the end of the day. And so that's like it's always something that's kind of followed me because like I've like never not been Sappony, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that we have to say that just because you're Sappony or just because you're Lumbee or just because whatever, etc. Like you don't have to be relegated to just talking about that. Like we can be and have larger voices. So that comes with good and bad, obviously.
Yeah, I think reading this piece too, I think like you said it best in the sense that it says, this quote, it says, you're talking about the statue that was taken down called the Fame statue.
Yeah.
And you say, and it was, excuse me, it was taken down in Salisbury. Am I getting that correct? And
Salisbury, yeah.
Salisbury, yeah.
That's all good.
Salisbury, and there was a neo-Confederate counter-protester who showed up and like just let off 2 shots against the Black Lives Matter folks who were there, demanding the statue being taken down. And it was a good piece in many sense because on one hand it showed how these statues, these Confederate statues, which were constructed, there's like over 700, 800, I think the Southern Poverty Law Center counts, between 1890 and 1950, the era of Jim Crow, in an effort to like weave Confederate sympathies into the hearts and minds of everybody, not just like Confederate sympathizers, but like everybody. And when I was reading this, I couldn't help but thinking about in South Dakota history, where I'm from, and it's not so clear for non-Indigenous people, but somebody like Gutzon Borglum, who was the sculptor of Mount Rushmore, the Shrine of Democracy, where Trump held his rally, was also unequivocally a Klan supporter, a supporter of the Ku Klux Klan. And his first major work was of 3 Confederate leaders, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson at Stone Mountain in Georgia, just outside of Atlanta. The very location where the Klan was reborn by like a torchlight ceremony on Thanksgiving Day of all days in 1915. And a year before, that memorial to the Confederacy was actually conceived, because he actually began construction, I believe, in 1916.
Yeah.
And it was actually that work in this kind of like this, uptick in creating Confederate monuments throughout not just the South. I mean, because some of them were constructed in the North as well.
Yeah.
But this uptick in creating these Confederate monuments actually led to the creation of Mount Rushmore. And, he wasn't like hiding his views. He was like an open, very open white supremacist in many ways. But I remember just thinking about that, like that, even, that conditioning itself. And there's another layer to it. You can, you say, you write eloquently, and yet somehow I'd allowed the seed to sprout, the seed that, if you take these statues down, things will change, despite the evidence waving in front of my face that you can radically change the physical landscape of a place without changing its soul. And I think like what you're talking about is not just about the statue protests themselves, but I think the larger issue of, if you're just making cosmetic changes to the system, you're not actually changing the very essence of the system, which is a white supremacist structure.
That's right. And it's something that is really hard to break out of if you don't, like, if you grow up in a place where you, like, if you don't have any other external voices, right? Like if your parents aren't telling you, or your aunts and uncles or your grandparents or somebody isn't like, pulling you aside as a kid and being like, no, this is fucked up. You should, like, we have to grapple with how terrible this history is. Like, if you don't have that person there, it becomes normalized so easily in such a, like, you could write, and I'm sure people have, like, books about like just how like this culture of Confederate sympathy seeps down. I mean, it's not just something where it's, you know, these ardent neo-Confederates, militia types. I mean, and we're talking about like it's something that infiltrates like your school curriculum and your town square, and even if like you remove that, you then have to like do the work of removing, not just removing, but just maybe updating or upgrading people's understandings of their physical place in terms of like what it has meant to be of this place. Like what does it mean to be of a rural county in North Carolina, and then like breaking down what that means as a native person. You know, like trying to grasp all of that is like something that I will continue to grapple with until I am a very, very old person, and maybe I will at some point figure it out and then immediately pass on. Like that, it's going to be a lifelong battle to like kind of unwind that just within myself. So I recognize doing that communally is something of a tall project. But at the same, I think that also that sentiment also works like you can flip it to not like it's a kind of a pessimistic view, right? Or maybe more of a realistic view, but like this idea that like you can't go about you know, you, just by removing Confederate monuments, you're not inherently fixing racism in the South, or this idea of what a Confederate, what the Confederacy stood for. But conversely, it's like we, as especially as Indigenous people, I mean, we've seen our lands radically changed by imperialism over the past several centuries, and I would argue that the places themselves, like when I go back to High Plains, I mean that place. I mean, Duke Energy built a plant there. They dammed up one of our rivers. They built a lake there in the 50s and 60s. Like they radically changed the landscape of that place, right? But that's still High Plains. That's still Sappony land, and I don't like the feeling that you get when you're there is like it's almost like a converse feeling of like the feeling that I feel just being back home, in that like I know that even without fame, the Confederate statue standing in the town square, that racism is still very prevalent in Salisbury. I think we can also use that same sense to say that like there are some like optimistic views of that, to say that like as and when we're thinking about ourselves as Indigenous people and communities, is to say that like we there's been an active battle to like cosmetically change our lands and our waterways in a sense to like snuff us out, and it has not worked. So we have to then apply that same, I think, a similar logic to saying that like we can cosmetically change our town square, we can cosmetically or not cosmetically, but we can update our school curriculum. So we still have to do the internal work of going about like just appealing to people as humans, because like it's like you said earlier, like I there's a lot of disdain out there for people who voted for Trump among the left and you know liberals. But I think that you have to come with it at that same understanding that all of this isn't so cut and dry in terms of how people are motivated politically or culturally, and that if you're really invested in a long-term solution, that you have to like be willing to engage. Like there's no getting rid of 67 million people, or however many of the people it is that voted for him. Like you either invest yourself in doing the work of both organizing the people who are already on your side, but then also trying to understand how you can organize those people as well, because it's not impossible. We've seen this done throughout centuries of political organizing. We've seen like you can go back to the late 1900s in the South and like look at some of the farming organizing that was going on there. I mean, it wasn't just like white farmers. I mean, sometimes it was, but it was white farmers, it was native farmers, it was black farmers, it was people rising up against like this larger oppressive system. And I think that you can kind of draw these historical inspirations from places like that to say that like this moment we're in really sucks, but it's not an it's not an impossibility for us to find a way out of it. It's never going to be perfect, but you know we can find a path forward.
Yeah, and I think in the South's history, you know, if you look at somebody like Henry Berry Lowry,
Yeah.
he was an indigenous person who fought, both the Confederates in some instances, but also like led a guerrilla war of both black and poor white people against the Confederacy itself. And it's like there is that like tradition of resistance, but it has to be the one that's foregrounded.
Yeah.
That's not necessary. I mean, because the other kind of like tendency is to fall towards that kind of national kind of redemption narrative that I think is very prevalent. It's like, well, if you look at Abraham Lincoln, like he's a very, I mean, I wouldn't say he's just a very problematic figure. He's actually a reviled figure in many indigenous communities, mine included. He was the one who ordered the mass hanging of my ancestors at Makato or Mankato in 1862. And he, oversaw the Sand Creek Massacre, the Whitestone Hill Massacre, the Navajo Long Walk. This all happened during the Civil War by Union soldiers. And like you can't. It's not this cut and dry thing. But I think like it's also not about just kind of like identifying like whether or not like Abraham Lincoln did good or bad things to Native people. It requires a kind of structural thinking about the project of American history and American empire that you can't just distill from I mean this is my love critique from the liberal milieu that's out there in these especially in these coastal like media outlets. And it's not to be, I mean, there is like and I feel it like I grew up in a rural environment. I didn't go to a prestigious school. I went to state school my entire life, and that's where I got my education. And there is a kind of elitism that I've encountered, not just within the media and academic realms, but also within the organizing realms as well, that these places are already foregone, that we should forget about them. And it's like it's such a stupid move in my mind. Like there's no, and like even New Mexico is ripe for that kind of political mobilization. And I've seen it happen. I've seen people in the state and places that are forgotten do incredible things. Like we got Indigenous Peoples Day. We were one of the like first cities when that all started springing off, and people came from the countryside into the city. And there isn't this, like New Mexico is not an urban environment. It's very rural. And so that's something that I think is like incredibly important, is that we actually have to, we can't just cede so much ground to the right and to these kind of histories and ways of thinking that have really seeped into these places. Because if we do, we're forgetting that it's the thing about white supremacy is that it's like it's first and foremost about convincing like white people of a certain kind of ideology. That's the first thing. And so in like South Dakota, where I'm from, like I find it fascinating that the majority of people who are dying from COVID-19 are white people. And Kristi Noem, the governor, is just being glorified by the right and the Republican Party as the number one boss. People are actually talking about a potential presidential run for 2024. She's being flown all over the country to these $5,000 plate fundraisers in Mar-a-Lago and elsewhere, to because she's the new darling of the Republican Party. And she's like invested in the QAnon world and in the kind of right-wing conspiracy world that has kind of grown up around Trump. And like that ideology is not, it's not just like bad for Indigenous people, it's bad for everybody. I mean, again, like the majority of people who died in South Dakota are like poor white people. Her like attorney general, the top cop in the state, killed a man and walked like, and it made international news. And I'm just like, I'm blown away. And like, I just don't even know what to say to people when they talk, when they say anything about South Dakota, this or that. I'm like, yo, dude, like these, like there's some like real like criminal element, in the way that this is, unfolding. And it's not just like against indigenous people, it's like literally against the well-being of the people she's supposed to protect and serve, and the entire planet, and that's what makes
Yeah.
somebody like her like very dangerous. And again, I think it's important to think about that on a structural level as well, that this ideology has permeated, like, when you were talking, when I was reading this piece, it's like I think it's easy to forget that the Civil War was the only war in history that ended with the losers of that war being able to construct statues and monuments of its generals, its
Yeah.
leaders, its soldiers, and its politicians, not only in its own territory, but also in the territory of the so-called victors.
Right.
And in that sense, the South actually won because it
Yeah.
got Jim Crow and it got this culture war that we're currently fighting, and it got the Trump, it got the Trump kind of the Trump movement that we have. And Joe Biden isn't, he's not immune from that either. He was a pro-segregationist, he was the architect of the Clinton era crime bill. It's, like the whole Anita Hill thing, like in Clarence Thomas, like back in the 90s. So it's like, in that sense, it's like, I mean, there is, like, when I was reading this piece, it was like, yeah, there is a sense of mourning that you have, and it's because the South actually has won,
Yeah.
and I don't think people have really confronted that like as a reality.
Yeah, I think that's a good like long-term view on it. Because like again, like if you're looking at this, like I think it like who's this conversation that like we look at it and that like not we but like everybody look at it beyond like this kind of it can oftentimes kind of be like bifurcated by like this sense of saying like, well, the South was democratic for a long time, and then the civil rights era happened, and then it steadily became more and more Republican, and then North Carolina exploded as a kind of a red state, at least state politics in the mid 2000s following Obama's election in 2008, and so like what you have to kind of unpack there is this like larger history that like kind of removes like if you're actually talking about like finding that a way out of that, right? Because like if we concede and say that the South won in that sense, you have to look at like how they managed to do that, and it wasn't
Mhm.
necessarily always through military action. They very clearly lost that,
Yeah,
but it was through this kind of like cultural like just
it's like a
total.
war of ideas.
Yeah, yeah, and like what that ultimately bred was like not so dissimilar from what we're seeing now with like the rise of all these kind of far right media outlets that just kind of operate on a different plane of existence from what's actually happening in front of us. But it's like that is like we can't be that surprised that like things like Newsmax and Breitbart and Parler and all these things exist now because it's like you effectively like did that on a cultural scale by reorienting how people understood this thing that happened in the 1860s. Is like this same kind of misinformation and decontextualization of like what actually happened is like a very long-standing tradition of in terms of how conservatives organize. There's also many other like there's obviously the whole line of them being anti-democratic, which they very clearly are through gerrymandering and redlining and all of and disenfranchisement. But you also have to look at like if you want to win people back, you have to like at the end of the day, we know that a lot of these policies that the left kind of pushes for and propagates are like if you poll them, they're popular. They are like people like them.
Yeah,
The issue that you run into is that one, you have this larger political establishment in the Democratic Party that sits there and is wholly content to just not be the other team and post on that. So if you are not actively on the ground, like I think a lot of people gave Stacey Abrams a lot of credit for flipping Georgia because she actually like went into communities and did the work. It's like what has to come out of this is not the fact that like we need to throw more money at like a sentient piece of white toast like Cal Cunningham. Like, what it should be is that like we have to be hyper regional in the way that we organize. You can't say somebody in DC that is paid $600,000 a year to consult on national campaigns doesn't have any clue what's like how to flip a rural district in North Carolina. Not saying that I do either, but like we have to put it on the people that actually live in these places to actually be the ones that flip it. Not like it can't be like a top down routine. It has to be a bottom up routine. And in doing that, the reason that that oftentimes doesn't work in these places is, I mean, it's not wholly one issue at all, but like it is something to say that like if you don't have any sort of like functioning very clear, this is the thing, very clear messaging what on whatever the case is, but like then you're going to like just, and you can see that you're just going to lose these like red pockets, then you're not really doing the work of governance. You're doing the work of politics, and I think that that oftentimes can be really frustrating to see as somebody who's a little bit more organized, takes a little bit more of an organizing mindset into thinking about these things. But it's like, yeah, like of course, like Kristi Noem is going to be a presidential candidate in one of the next few cycles because she has done exactly what she's needed to do in terms of her national branding. It's like, you know exactly what you're getting with her, right? And it's like, I guess you could argue that you know what you're getting with Joe Biden, but the way that I think more nationally that Democrats are branded is just in this like very malleable way that allows everybody on the right just to scream and call them socialists, which maybe they would do a little better if they actually propagated some of those policies that they're being attributed to, but they're not. And so then you're just left with this huge messaging gap that's easily filled by right-wing misinformation. And again, like that doesn't matter. Really, it doesn't always necessarily cleave to like whatever your identity, whatever you identify as. It can identify, it like can just materialize in the way that, if you're somebody who grew up in a rural place and you were taught Confederate or that it was this is something I literally heard my whole life. It was the war of northern aggression opposed to the Civil War. And like think about that. Like I'm somebody who was born in '93, came up, graduated high school in 2012. Like that's 8 years ago, and we're still dealing with people that are going through that kind of education. So like the work of unwinding this has to be very, very methodical and very deep rooted. Otherwise, if it's just cosmetic, we're going to get the same results, and people are like, you're going to have people get very disenchanted in a post-Trump world, I think, with this idea that like, oh well, like whatever the next Trump is, like it's not going to be a 70-ish year old, former television host. Like it's going to be a smarter version. It's going to be Kristi Noem. It's going to be a
Tom Cotton.
like a glossier version of somebody who is more refined, who understands then how to both play like the political game that can keep them entrenched in political power while also galvanizing people through just like, your more racist and anti-indigenous rhetoric. Like it's not hard to do that. Like it's really like if I wanted to completely change my career around and go be like a conservative grifter, like I could make lots of money doing that tomorrow. Like the blueprint is right there. I think like what there's not been is a blueprint of how to effectively combat that. That has been adopted in the same way that Trumpism has by the Democratic Party. Like there's no left alternative to that. There's like several different versions of it that we're currently, like the party is trying to figure out which one it's going to take, which we don't have time for. We just like we can't have like a fucking debate in the Democratic primaries of like whether fracking is good anymore. We have totally used our time on that debate. Like we have got to like, get it together and move on to like the next more pressing issue. So like that can be, I think it's going to be a frustrating little bit like the next couple of years, because I don't think that a lot of these things are going to get the clarity in terms of messaging that they need.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining me, Nick. And we're running out of time, and we could continue this conversation. I, for one, don't think I'm not of the mindset of that the Democratic Party can be pushed or that it could do these things if it was just like pushed and pulled in the right way. I think that like fundamentally, like history has proven that they just aren't willing to do them. So
Yeah.
it's not like a pessimistic view; it's a realistic view. But I think like the things that you laid out, as far as it's not just about like it's not just about looking at like what counties go blue and then being like, how can we increase Democratic representation in those areas. But it's actually understanding that like oftentimes elections are kind of litmus tests in some ways, and whether or not we agree with the parties that are being elected, nonetheless they're somewhat of a political barometer, because that's how most of this country, whether we like it or not, understands politics, and quote unquote democracy. I wouldn't there's a big difference between the two, but like I think that there is it's a way to get a gauge, and we shouldn't just turn away from them because they disgust us or we're so pessimistic about it that we shouldn't pay attention. We should pay attention because it helps us understand where people are at, and that's where we have to be, I guess, as like and as like just people who are like human beings, is like to meet people where they're at. And I think that's the importance of it's not like to like reach across the aisle, like fuck that.
Yeah.
It's to actually understand like why people are doing things and like what are the material conditions that inform their decisions. So I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on the show. I'll post the link to the article that you wrote about North Carolina in the wake of the elections. And where else, where can people find your work on social media and where you're writing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and again, I really appreciate you having me on today. This is like, I don't listen to podcasts as much as I used to, but like this is the one that I still like queue up on a weekly basis. So it was great to be in conversation with you today, Nick. People can find me on Twitter at Nick_Martin. I don't really tweet a lot, so like you'll just be getting my stories there basically. And then also my work can be found at newrepublic.com. And subscription, I think, is like $5 a month, which isn't like as outrageous as I've seen other places. So, if you guys would like to read, by all means, that's the best way to do it. But then I'm sure I'll be publishing around other places. I freelance a little bit too, but that just kind of varies. But yeah, those are the main places. And again, I really appreciate you having me on today.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.